Hello, and welcome to you all, and welcome to the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, the Symposium. Hello, welcome to you all here today. Firstly, may I start by acknowledging, paying my respects and gratitude to the traditional owners and custodians of the land where we sit, stand, and meet on here today, tonight, tomorrow, and always. The First Nations people, the Bidjigal people. And I pay my respects and give gratitude to my elders, past, present, and future emerging. And I bring to mind and light all their many endeavours and attributes and achievements into Australian society where they have been denied. Today we stand tall in all that we do and give to our country, Aboriginal Australia, and to your mammoth education learning institution that sits on sacred land that we share with you and all, your students from the many countries across the world. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Ferguson, the Director of the Research and International Policy section in the Alcohol, Tobacco and Other Drugs branch at the Department of Health. I start by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I also extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Welcome everyone to session 3 of the 2021 annual NDARC Research Symposium. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the fantastic work of NDARC, which, as you know, has been in operation for over 30 years and continues to expand and undertake groundbreaking research on alcohol and other drug use. I express the department's appreciation for NDARC's continued delivery of novel and high-quality research, and I'm very pleased to be opening the session today. This session will feature a first look at the 2021 Annual Drug Trends Report, presented by NDARC's Acting Lead of Drug Trends, Dr. Rachel Sutherland. As you may know, the Drug Trends Program is internationally renowned and key to identifying emerging substance use trends in Australia and providing impetus for policy responses and intervention. Of course, this session was originally intended to be in person on campus at UNSW, but the events of this year have meant that's not possible. I'm told that an in-person event will be scheduled for the first quarter of next year and hope that some of us can meet in person then. It'll be great to get together again. The full program for today can be found on the NDARC website, including speakers' abstracts and speakers' bios. I'm pleased to advise that today's program is as follows. Firstly, Dr. Rachel Sutherland will present on the 2021 Australian Drug Trends Report. This will be followed by a panel discussion facilitated by Daniel Madiju, Executive Director for the Centre of Alcohol and Other Drugs at the New South Wales Ministry of Health. Panel members include Dr. Susie Hudson, Clinical Director of NADA, Dr. Sean Green, Clinical Toxicologist and Emergency Medicine Physician at Austin Hospital, Mr. Chris Goff, Executive Director, Canberra Alliance for Harm Minimisation and Advocacy, and Dr. Rachel Sutherland, Project Lead for Drug Trends. We'll then have a presentation on featured posters and an announcement of poster winners. I'm also pleased we can be joined in this session by our Auslan interpreters, Leah and Kate. It's great to have you join us and expand the access of this session. Please also note you can view this year's posters and poster presentations on the NDARC website. You've also been sent links to this information via email, and a recording will also be available after the session over the next few days. I'm now very pleased to hand over to NDARC Director, Professor Michael Farrell, who will provide some highlights from NDARC. Over to you, Michael. Thanks, everyone. Have a great session.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Welcome, everybody, and I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, past, present and future, and recognise that I'm speaking from Gadigal land, but also to note that we're speaking across many lands, and I would like to welcome people from those lands and note the remarkable capacity of the new technology to join us up across great distances I do regret that we're not meeting in person, but I'm also very thankful for the fact that we have this capacity, despite COVID and these things, to get together. This is our third day, and we've had a very large audience, a very lively discussion, and a lot of very broad work presented. I would today like to thank Dr. Rachel Sutherland, Senior Research Fellow and Acting Director of the Drug Trends Programme, who's really is presenting a whole year's work. And in particular, I'd like to note the challenge of COVID for this work, where they have managed to pivot from in-person interviews after lockdown to interviews online, and have done a remarkable job to complete the task despite all of these difficulties. After Rachel's presentation, as Sarah has said, we will have a broad panel discussion to tease out what we think is happening, and we will be very interested to have your questions and input to this. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and if you could put any questions you have into the Q&A and not the chat function, I would be very appreciative. Also, towards the end of this session, there's a brief poster session, and that there are a number of very short presentations demonstrating work from people at NDARC. And after that, I will announce both the People's Choice poster winner and the Judges poster winner, and wrap up that session. We will be finished by just before 11, and I thank you for your attention, and I hand over to Rachel.
Thank you, Michael, for that, and thanks, Sarah, for your opening remarks as well. So before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting today, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be here today. I'd also like to acknowledge that Drug Trends is a national collaborative project, and there's many different people to thank. So I'd like to thank our funders from the Department of Health, as well as everyone at NDARC and externally who has contributed to Drug Trends both this year and over previous years. And of course, would like to thank all of the participants the thousands of participants who have shared their knowledge and experiences with us over the past couple of decades. And of course, would like to acknowledge the data custodians, stakeholders and the advisory committee, as well as ABLE and Students for Sensible Drug Policy for their input and collaboration with Drug Trends. So for those of you who may not be too familiar with Drug Trends, I will just give you a very brief overview. So as Sarah mentioned, so Drug Trends is a program of work that's designed to monitor trends in drug use, drug harms and drug markets across Australia. And we do that in a number of different ways. So we do some primary data collection. So every year we do about 900 surveys with people who inject drugs, and we do about 800 surveys with people who use ecstasy and other stimulants. In addition to that, we analyse existing indicator data sources, so in particular, drug-related hospitalisations and drug-induced deaths. And then we also have our crypto market monitoring component of the project, where we kind of monitor what drugs are being sold on crypto markets or darknet markets. Today's presentation is largely going to be focused on our findings from our surveys with people who use drugs, but I will refer a little bit to some of the kind of secondary data sources as well. So just to give you a better understanding of the differences between the two different samples that we do surveys with. So as I mentioned, the illicit drug reporting system, or the IDRS, comprises surveys with people who inject drugs recruited from capital cities across Australia. So they're mostly male, so about 2/3 male, and typically in their mid-40s, so median age of 45, mostly unemployed and have high levels of kind of engagement with the criminal justice system and with treatment services as well. In comparison, our EDRS survey comprises surveys with people who use ecstasy and other stimulants. Again, about 2/3 male, but they're typically a younger kind of sample of people, so in their mid to early 20s, and kind of most of the students and/or currently employed, and they have much lower levels of engagement with the criminal justice system with drug treatment services. And important to note that these are not representative samples, but they're not designed to be representative samples either, but rather they're sentinel samples which are designed to detect emerging trends in substance use. Also important to note, because they are recruited from capital cities across Australia, our findings can't be generalised to regional or rural areas. And I do just want to flag that most of our data collection for this year was actually before the current wave of COVID-19 and the associated government restrictions. So there may have been further kind of impacts on drug markets and drug use that were not detected in our surveys. As Michael said, so COVID has had an impact on drug trends both this year and last year. So historically, we used to do all of our surveys face-to-face. Last year, our surveys were done by telephone, and this year was kind of a hybrid approach where we did them initially face-to-face, but then switched to telephone when COVID started to take off. And we do kind of need to keep those changes in mind as well. And of course, ideally, this information will be interpreted in context with other data sources, and I'll endeavour to do that throughout the presentation. This is really just a visual representation of the impact that COVID-19 has had on both the EDRS and the IDRS, both this year and last year. Okay, so today I'm just going to be presenting some of the top 5 findings that came out from this year's surveys, and I'm kind of going to reveal those as we go through. And perhaps not surprisingly, the first thing I wanted to talk about is that we have potentially seen a disruption to the ecstasy market according to our surveys. So I focused on ecstasy caps and crystal here because they are the most commonly used forms among our sample of people who use ecstasy and other stimulants. And this year we have seen reductions in perceived purity and availability. So in particular, we've seen decreases in the proportion of our sample who reported that the purity of caps was high, and this was even more pronounced for crystal, so fewer numbers reporting that the purity was high. In addition, we've also seen reductions in availability or perceived availability. So more people this year were reporting that ecstasy caps were difficult or very difficult to obtain, and also more people reporting that caps were difficult or very difficult to obtain. But as we can see, the majority of people do still perceive them as being kind of fairly easy to obtain. And we saw an increase in the price of all forms of ecstasy as well. So all of those indicators are kind of pointing in the right direction. So purity is down, availability is down, price is up, indicating to us that there may have been a disruption to the ecstasy market. In addition to that, we did see reductions in ecstasy use among our EDRS sample. So we saw substantial reductions in the proportion of our sample who reported caps in the past 6 months, as well as reductions in those reporting the use of pills and powder, although ecstasy crystal did remain relatively stable. In addition to that, we saw reductions in frequency of use, as well as kind of reductions in the median amount that people were using. I guess, our concern with this is that if people have reduced their use of ecstasy throughout the pandemic, so they're using less frequently and less amounts, their tolerance has probably dropped. So as we start to come out of lockdown and people, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria, people might start to resume or increase their use of ecstasy, and that could potentially pose them at increased risk of overdose or other kind of adverse effects, especially given some of the public health alerts that we've seen recently regarding ecstasy crystal being adulterated with PMMA. So we really do encourage anyone who might be using drugs if they start to resume or increase their use to kind of employ harm reduction strategies when doing so. The other kind of changes that we saw were in relation to the methamphetamine and heroin markets. So I put these together because these were the two kind of markets that seem to have been mostly impacted according to our surveys from last year. So this is actually a slide from last year's presentation that Amy gave. And as we can see, we did see disruptions to heroin and methamphetamine, which seem to align with other research as well. And the questions that were posed last year, so we saw a reduction in methamphetamine use as well. The questions posed were, would this reduction in use be sustained? And would these markets rebound with lessening restrictions? And really the short answer to that is no, reductions in use haven't been sustained. And yes, it appears that the markets have rebounded. So if we look at that in a bit more detail, so as I mentioned, so last year we saw this kind of increase in the price of crystal methamphetamine, and I'm focusing on crystal methamphetamine here because it is the main form of methamphetamine used in Australia. So we saw this increase in price, so doubled to $100 for a point of crystal methamphetamine. We also saw this reduction in purity last year, so less people reporting that perceived purity was high. And we also saw this reduction in availability, so fewer people reporting that it was easy or very easy to obtain. As you can see, last year it's kind of gone back to what it was pre-COVID pretty much. So we're back down to $50 for a point of crystal methamphetamine. About 28% of those able to answer were reporting the perceived purity as high, which is pretty similar to what we were seeing before COVID. And again, most people reporting that it's easy or very easy to obtain. Last year, we also saw a reduction in methamphetamine use among our sample of people who inject drugs. Again, that's kind of bounced back up and is looking very similar to what we were seeing back in 2019 and is continuing that kind of upward trend that we've been seeing for a number of years. And I guess more concerning is this kind of increase in more frequent use of methamphetamine. So the proportion of our sample of people who inject drugs increased. So 58% reported that they'd use methamphetamine weekly or more in the past 6 months, which is the highest percentage that we've seen since monitoring began. We also saw for the first time methamphetamine overtake heroin as a nominated drug of choice, and also an increase in the proportion of our sample of people who inject drugs reporting that methamphetamine was the drug injected most often in the past month. In comparison, our sample of people who use ecstasy and other stimulants remained stable last year, and is a continuation of that kind of downward trend that we've been seeing for a while. And again, frequency of use has also remained relatively stable on the entire sample. If we look at those who had used methamphetamine among our sample of people who used ecstasy and other stimulants, we did see an increase in frequency. So the same number of people pretty much using methamphetamine in our EDR sample, those that are using it more frequently. And this kind of increase in methamphetamine use appears to be supported by the most recent wastewater report that was released, which found after falling to record low levels in August of 2020, average consumption of methamphetamine increased between August and December of 2020, which indicates a gradual recovery in the market. As I mentioned, our findings can't be generalised to regional or rural areas, but it was interesting to see in the wastewater report that capital city methamphetamine consumption exceeded regional consumption for the first time since April 2017. Also important to note that the rate of hospitalizations for amphetamine and other stimulants has kind of been increasing over time. And we haven't published our 2019-2020 data. That's due to be released next month, but there has been an increase there as well. This is a little bit of an older graph, but just showing that the rate of treatment episodes with amphetamines as a principal drug of concern has also increased over time. And I think this is important because, there's been increasing pressure on the New South Wales government to respond to the recommendations that were released as part of the Special Commission of Inquiry into the Drug ICE. And I think our findings do kind of support that need for urgent investment in methamphetamine treatment and support. In relation to heroin use, so last year we saw an increase in heroin use among our sample of people who inject drugs. But again, we can see this has dropped back down and is now kind of continuing that downward trend that we've been seeing for a number of years. And there remains a lot of jurisdictional variation in heroin use. And this kind of reduction was largely driven by reductions in Queensland, South Australia, and Victoria. And weekly or more use of heroin has also kind of declined this year. So as I mentioned, we did also see a disruption to the heroin market last year. And again, it seems like that's kind of partially recovered. So last year we saw that kind of increase in the proportion of participants reporting that the perceived purity was low, and we saw kind of a decrease in the perceived availability. But again, it's kind of gone back and looking very similar to what it was pre-COVID. Exception to that is price. So the price for a point of heroin has continued to increase this year. And I guess some of you may have seen that the AFP reported seizing 450 kilograms of heroin, which is reported to be the largest ever onshore detection, which would, potentially support this idea of kind of the heroin market recovering and now being kind of readily accessible. We also saw quite significant increases in cocaine use among our sample of people who use ecstasy and other stimulants. So as we can see, 80% of our sample reported that they had used cocaine in the past 6 months. And this is really a continuation of an upward trend that we've been seeing for quite a number of years. And this increase was driven primarily by Tasmania, New South Wales and Victoria. It is important to note though, frequency of use remains pretty low among this sample. So they were reported using a median of 3 days in the past 6 months, which is about, once every 2 months, so not particularly frequent. In contrast, cocaine use among our sample of people who inject drugs has remained comparatively low and stable. Again, a few changes to the cocaine market that were detected this year. So we saw this kind of reduction in perceived purity. So less people are reporting that the purity of cocaine was high. But we saw this kind of increase in availability. And interestingly, we saw the price of cocaine increase to $350 for a gram, which is kind of the first price increase that we've seen in over a decade. So a bit of a mixed picture, I guess, in regards to the cocaine market. And so to put this in a bit of context, so earlier this year, the Drug Trends team released a paper which looked at trends in cocaine use, markets and harms. And they kind of looked at a range of data sources. So they looked at use, seizures, arrests, hospitalizations and treatment. And essentially they found that all of these have been increasing over time. And those kind of increases have been more concentrated in recent years. Some of that data is a little bit back now. So the hospitalizations data, for example, was up until 2017-18. But if we look at this bottom graph here, we can see that in 2018-19, the rate of cocaine-related hospitalizations increased again. And again, in 2019-2020, which is unpublished data, there seems to be a small increase. But again, numbers do remain quite low there. The other kind of significant change that we saw was in relation to e-cigarettes. So we saw this quite increase in the proportion of our EDR samples, so our sample of people using ecstasy and other stimulants who reported past 6 months use of e-cigarettes. And interestingly, there was also this kind of decrease in past 6 month tobacco use. And we can't say for sure that they're related, but interesting trend to note nonetheless. And among our EDR sample, frequency of e-cigarette use also increased. We did see a bit of an increase in e-cigarette use among our sample of people who inject drugs, but really, if we look at the longer term trend, it's remained fairly stable over time, and tobacco use remains high among our sample of people who inject drugs as well. And this kind of increase in e-cigarette use is interesting because it's quite similar to what we found in our sample as well. So ADAPT is an online survey that we kind of set up in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, where we followed people up over a 12-month period. And the Wave 4 survey, which was a 12-month follow-up, was completed between April and July of this year, which overlapped with the EDRS recruitment period. And similarly, we can see that at Wave 4, there was this increase in the proportion of the sample who reported using e-cigarettes in the past 4 weeks. And we also saw kind of an increase in those reporting that their use of e-cigarettes had increased in the past month compared to before March 2020 or before COVID. And among our sample of people who use ecstasy, most people were using nicotine in their e-cigarettes, and this has kind of been increasing over time. And that's similar for the IDRS sample as well. And about 40% reported using e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation tool. Again, that's fairly similar as to what we saw among our sample of people who inject drugs. So as I'm sure most people would know, on the 1st of October this year, legislation was introduced, which means that people now need a prescription to obtain e-cigarettes that contain nicotine or e-liquids that contain nicotine. So the question for us is really, what impact that's going to have on our samples, and particularly what impact is it going to have on those who are using e-cigarettes as a smoking cessation tool. And finally, we did see some changes in use of hallucinogens and dissociatives as well. So we saw an increase in ketamine use, although that's kind of a continuation of an upward trend that we've been seeing for a number of years. And there remains a lot of jurisdictional variation in ketamine use. We also saw this kind of increase in hallucinogenic mushrooms, so 45% reporting that they'd used hallucinogenic mushrooms in the past 6 months, and a bit of an increase in DMT use, but nothing too major there. And use of other drugs like nitrous, amyl, LSD remained fairly stable. And I just wanted to end this presentation by focusing on some kind of harm reduction behaviours, not because we've seen any major changes on this front, but more so because I think it's really important to recognise that people who use drugs engage in a range of harm reduction behaviours. So we've been monitoring naloxone awareness and uptake among our sample of people who inject drugs for quite a number of years. And as you can see, awareness of naloxone has remained fairly stable over time. But as the accessibility of naloxone has increased, so too has the proportion of our sample that's been trained in naloxone administration. And if we focus on those who had used heroin in the past 6 months, we can see that 44% reported that they had access to naloxone in the past year. So there are kind of further opportunities there, I guess, to increase naloxone uptake among people who are using heroin and other opioids, of course. And there is a bit of jurisdictional variation there. So naloxone uptake among people using heroin was highest in WA, New South Wales and ACT, and lowest in Victoria. And this 0% in NT is really just because there was hardly anyone using heroin there. We also asked about drug tracking, so whether people had had drugs tested either themselves or by somebody else in the past year. And really the main point I want to make here is that the proportion of our sample who had tested their drugs in the past year has remained fairly stable throughout the pandemic, with about a third reporting that they'd done so in the past year. And for the first time, we also asked our ARS participants, so sample of people who inject drugs, if they'd had their drugs tested in the past year, and 8% had done so, and 14% reported lifetime experience of drug checking. And I think that's important to note because a lot of the drug checking debate in the Australian context seems to have largely been focused on kind of festival settings. And I think it's really important that we do include people who inject drugs in that conversation. And on that note, it was really exciting to see the ACT government announce the 6-month pilot for a fixed site pill testing service. But again, just want to kind of flag that it's important that this service and services that might follow are kind of accessible to and inclusive of all people who inject drugs, all people who use drugs, and that includes people who inject drugs as well. So that's a very brief snapshot of some of our key findings. Obviously, there's a lot more information in our report. So if you're interested, please jump online to check that out in more detail. And our jurisdictional reports are due to be released in December of this year and January of next year. And we also have a range of other really fantastic presentations from across the Drug Trends program of work, some of which will be highlighted in the poster session Michael mentioned, but encourage you to jump on our website as well to check those out. And if you do have any questions or if you'd like any further information about something, please feel free to reach out to us. And that's it from me.
That's great. Thank you very much. You get a chance to now have a deep breath, Rachel.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Daniel. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre for Alcohol and Other Drugs at the New South Wales Ministry of Health. And I've been given the honour of facilitating a panel discussion after Rachel's presentation. We have some people from a range of different backgrounds, and Rachel, if you don't mind, we'd like you to stay. And just a reminder for everyone, Rachel's the acting lead of the drug trends at NDARC. She's an experienced research fellow with more than 11 years experience in the AOD sector. Joining us will also be Dr. Susie Hudson. Susie's the clinical director at the Network of Alcohol and Other Drugs Agencies. And Susie provides clinical advice and consultation for NADA members and contributes to the policy and advocacy submissions. We have Dr. Sean Green, who's just joined us now. Now, Sean is a clinical toxicologist and emergency medicine physician who works at Austin Health in Melbourne. Sean is currently the medical director at the Victorian Poisons Information Centre and director of the Austin Hospital Clinical Toxicology Service. And we also have Mr. Chris Goff. Chris is the executive director of the Canberra Alliance for Harm Minimisation and the Connection Health Services. He has more than 10 years experience in bloodborne virus and alcohol, tobacco and other drug sectors, and identifies as a person who uses drugs and has done so for over 25 years. Now, Chris, I don't see your screen. Are you able to turn your camera on, please? Ah, fantastic. So, welcome panel. And I'll just start off by thanking Rachel again for the presentation. It's such rich information. There's an incredible amount for us to absorb, and we're really lucky to have you guys here as a panel to kind of start us on that journey of how do we make sense of this. And Professor Farrell kicked it off to begin with when he said, you know, well, what do we think is happening, you know, around this? And so I think we now give ourselves a nice half an hour plus to kind of think about, well, from your different perspectives, what stands out for you? What's important for you? The kind of leading questions are, you know, what do we think are happening? How do we use this, you know, this incredibly valuable information? And what do we think the impact of some of these changes will be? I'm going to keep an eye on to see whether there are some questions for us to follow up on, and some are already there. But I might just kick off maybe with Dr. Green to begin with, if that's okay. Sean, I'm really interested from your perspective of how this report accords with your experience as the director at the Poisons Information Centre and at Austin Hospital.
Thanks, Daniel, and everyone for the opportunity to speak. I just need to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Alliance this morning here in Melbourne, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My experience extends a little bit beyond my role as a clinical toxicologist and emergency physician, and that I've been the lead of the Emerging Drugs Network of Australia project that is in with Victoria and has been running for the last 12 months. Now, this is a state version of the wider or emerging network that many of you may have heard about, the Emerging Drugs Network of Australia, being led by some very capable people in Western Australia. But we've had the opportunity over the last 12 months to analyse blood samples taken from patients presenting to emergency departments in 9 metropolitan Melbourne hospitals and 1 regional centre, who are presenting with illicit drug toxicity, either reported or suspected. And the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine here in Melbourne have undertaken an analysis looking for nearly 500 different pharmaceuticals and illicit drugs. And so most of my commentary today is based on that experience. And we've had nearly 500 cases enrolled in that system over the past 12 months with some interesting findings. And I'll just highlight some of the interesting ones. In terms of the information that's gleaned from different sources, from all the good work that people in the community do within this community, one of the startling things we found was the 90% of our cases, there was a difference between what was reported by the patient who presented to the emergency department and what was found analytically. So I guess there was underreporting, misreporting, or substitution. And bearing in mind that this population doesn't necessarily represent intravenous drug users or users of ecstasy and those types of tablets in the community, it does represent people that become unwell enough to need to go to an emergency department. And most of those people, well, a large majority, seem not to know what they had ingested, suggesting that the product that they've used or obtained had other drugs. 50% of cases had methamphetamine in them. So even though it wasn't reported, that was by far the most commonly detected substance. We found 6 illicit benzodiazepines, not PBS benzos. We found a number of cathinones and stimulants, some hallucinogens. And 63% of people who presented also had a pharmaceutical drug on board, not necessarily one that was prescribed to them. So lots of benzodiazepines, lots of antipsychotic type medications. One of the interesting findings in terms of ecstasy was that we've found substitution. So the PMMA that was mentioned earlier was found in a patient reportedly using a yellow crystalline substance here in Melbourne. And we've found quite a number of cathinones present in those cases as well. So that to me, I guess, raises the possibility that I guess it's something we all know, but what people are using or users of drugs in the community are not always aware of exactly what is being supplied. And I don't think that's anything new, but certainly this project has, in my mind, really reinforced that. So I'm happy to take or make further comments based on the findings, but that's the main, in answer to your question, Daniel, that's the main question I would come up with is how we, I guess, follow these patients up within this project and ideally interview them to find out a little bit more whether this population differs a lot, for example, from Rachel's population, and therefore those that, explain the differences.
That's great. Thank you so much. My mind immediately goes to Chris from there. It's about people not being aware of what is in their medications, in their drugs, and then how they're going to be using it. But Chris, I might start from there, but really it's open-ended for you. I think you bring such an important perspective to this as the CEO of a peer-based harm minimization organization. Like, from your perspective, like, how do we use this invaluable information that we get from these reports? And also, what do you think is going on?
Sure. Can I first just pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking from, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Look, and before I begin, I'd also just like to acknowledge the wonderful work that Jude Byrne has done over the last, so many decades, and her forthright intelligence and resolve, wisdom have been pivotal in making people who use drugs central in being part of their own health and well-being, and she's going to be sadly missed. Interesting, very interesting what Sean's talking about. And so 90% of people had taken the wrong thing, in the data. Now when I hear that, my mind goes to what it's like when you take something, when you think you take something and then you take something else, and what effect it has on your body and your mind, and it can be it's horrifying, and yes, you might end up in hospital. Whether that can be taken as being a sign of outside, what generally happens outside of hospital or not, I'm unsure of, or whether it's a case of just how dangerous it is to take something different than what you're expecting. and how likely you are to end up in emergency from that experience. But really fascinating stuff. I guess what we've seen on the ground generally has been a lot of turbulence in drug markets over the last kind of year and a half, and that shows very clearly in the data. We saw the first lockdown last year, we saw, a couple of month period where nothing really happened on the streets. And then we saw everything suddenly change, and it dried up and prices shot up, purity shot down, and that was across methamphetamine and heroin and a lot of the drugs. And then we saw, and this is all anecdotal reports from our community, then we heard of a lot of people importing through the dark web, and a lot of some really, really strange stuff floating around, and the market was quite dangerous, but it was also quite low purity, and thank goodness, I think, at that stage. But then we had this interesting bounce back. It only took kind of 3 or 4 months, and drug market stabilized, and prices fell, and purity raised again, and that seems to have continued on, throughout 2021. Certainly in Canberra, there's reports of high purity heroin and high purity methamphetamine on the streets, and it hasn't necessarily changed with the second lockdown, which I know isn't in this report, but interestingly, we haven't seen that kind of crash yet, and so I mean, I think maybe it's just around the corner, but it feels different this time around. It feels like people have shored up networks, and it feels like everything's starting to stabilize. And of course, the other thing that's been really pivotal for our community is just how difficult COVID has been in terms of isolating for a person who uses or a person who injects drugs, and the differences in how people can access drug treatment services like residential rehabilitation. Some have closed, some have altered the way that they operate, opioid maintenance treatment, or whatever you call it in your neck of the woods. Pharmacotherapy for opioids has been an interesting, we produced some guidelines in order to try and, because we saw this coming. How do you stabilize somebody if they have to isolate on methadone or Suboxone, and there was no guidelines for it, and so we worked. It was great that we worked that hard. The other thing is around methamphetamine treatment, and I think this again goes back to Sean's data. 50% around came up with methamphetamine in your data, Sean. And one of the things that we've really struggled with is not having a full breadth of methamphetamine treatment options for people. As we go through this journey, it's been increasingly obvious that drug treatment responses to methamphetamines, this is an area we really need to wrap our heads around. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Two things stand out for me in your response, but one was about, you're talking about like how networks have kind of corralled and stabilized. And I think there's something there about, I don't know, the resilience of user networks and the wisdom that they're able to work together, but also tap into services as well. But then you also gave a really good segue that goes directly to Susie now, which is about service delivery impacts, really. And so Susie, I'm curious from your point of view in your role of consultation for clinical advice to the non-gov sector, and your advisor and your policy advocacy role generally, the implications of the reports that we've just had, like what stands out for you, and I suppose in particular that COVID overlay.
Thanks, Daniel, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land as part of the Eora Nation here in New South Wales. Look, I think it's really, really helpful and interesting to hear the data, not just from Rachel, but also from Sean and Chris. We obviously in the treatment sector, we often see a bit of a delay in what comes through the door. And certainly a lot of the people that would be involved responding to the EDRS and IDRS, they may not experience problems associated with their use. They may manage that perfectly well, and so they may never come into contact with a treatment service. But what we do know is that there is enormous pressure in terms of availability of treatment. And we have seen a bit of a switch. So the 2019-2020 data in the NGO sector would tell us that predominantly it was methamphetamine coming through the doors. 2020-21 has seen a bit of a shift, and it's sort of switched from being primary alcohol presentations and then secondary, and then the second most common drug that people turn up for treatment for is methamphetamine. So I think all the way through that theme, that strong theme around methamphetamine is still extremely present, not just in those who are using drugs, but those who are seeking treatment. And I'd agree absolutely with Chris about the need for more treatment options. And I suppose investment in those treatment options. And following on, I think, Rachel raised really well that, interventions or responses like the Special Commission into the drug ICE, we do need to respond to those, because COVID has presented, again, a lot of pressure on an already pressured alcohol and other drug treatment service sector. And I think what's been interesting in terms of stories from the front line in treatment is that perhaps those who are using, and in this case, say methamphetamine, whereas perhaps pre-lockdown experience, they might have managed quite well in terms of the balance within their own lives. So they may well have been using methamphetamine, but perhaps able to manage it better amongst other things that they were engaging with, whether that was work or study or family or other pastimes. But with the experience of lockdown, the ability to manage and to have that balance for quite a few people has shifted. And so, and I think, there's definitely data to tell us that specifically around alcohol use, there's been some significant increases. And what we would hear from the front line is that there has been this over a present demand from a different cohort of people who perhaps may not have needed treatment in the past, but have found the isolation and the absence of, say, specific routines has impacted their ability to manage their substance use. And certainly, I suppose, for that more intensive treatment options, such as residential treatment, there's been a massive shift. Those services have had really to think carefully about the risk associated with COVID. And I think the good news is that they're in a much better position now to respond. And there's a real perception, I suppose, within the treatment sector that, COVID is not going away, and it's something that we need to manage. And so that's a very pleasing thing. But I think what we know from the drug trends reports is often there's a bit of a delay into the treatment services sector. And so it's really critical that we keep our eyes on that. And I think methamphetamine is a very good example too of perhaps where we didn't quite get it right in terms of the should I say, sort of sensationalist campaigns that then I think meant that people didn't reach out when they did need help. They were delaying in terms of reaching out because of that stigma associated particularly with methamphetamine. And so I suppose it tells us a lot about the real need, particularly as people come out of lockdown scenarios, that we tell the community that there is a breadth of treatment available, albeit under pressure and under-resourced, but that they are not in a situation where they feel, due to stigma associated with substance use, that they can't reach out for help, because we know that the sooner we can get that treatment to them, the better the outcomes.
Thanks, Susie. Gang, we've got a number of questions and comments that are popping up here in the Q&A, so I'll turn my attention to there. One is, I think it's just, I'll ask it, and then I think it's open for all of us. Then there are a couple that I think are for Rachel in particular, and then a couple for Sean. But one there, I mean, Rachel, you use this really interesting device when you present. Like you presented us a whole lot of information, but a couple of times you prefaced with, what's concerning is, and my ears, pricked up immediately, and that's the stuff I listen very carefully to when you give those kind of intros. And someone's said here, look, given that people have been lockdown or locked up, they've got here for so long, is it reasonable to expect that there'll be a rebound or surge in use afterwards and a commensurate increase in hospitalisation or deaths due to changes in tolerance levels or changes in suppliers? I suppose this is one that's open for all of us. Any comments or insights or thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and obviously something that we're all kind of keeping an eye on. I mean, I would say that there's also a lot of jurisdictional variation. So, I mean, New South Wales and Victoria have obviously been in lockdown for quite a few months, but in other jurisdictions, they've been less impacted by those kind of restrictions. So you might kind of see less of that in other jurisdictions. But I think, certainly with the reduced use of ecstasy, for example, there is that concerns about that kind of reduced tolerance. And if people start to resume use, whether there'll kind of be that kind of subsequent increase in overdose or other kind of adverse events. And I think there will, as people have alluded to, continue to be volatility and fluctuations in the market as kind of we move through that's always been there, but particularly so as we move through the kind of COVID pandemic. So yeah, it's really difficult to kind of, I guess, predict. And I mean, in terms of hospitalizations and deaths and whatnot, that's also kind of difficult to see. Also because we've been seeing some upward trends for quite a while, kind of pre-COVID even. So trying to tease out what might be the impact of kind of COVID and coming out of lockdown and what's kind of a continuation of a trend that we've been seeing for quite a while is kind of difficult to tease apart. But yeah, certainly something that we'll be keeping a close eye on.
Great. Anyone else, like Sean or Chris, is there anything you think, particularly from a harm reduction perspective, we should have in the forefront of our minds?
Certainly, what we've been discussing in the last few weeks with the Freedom Day, as people are calling it here today, which horrifies me a little bit in terms of what we're going to be facing in the emergency department in the coming weeks. But, to me, the drugs that are used in a social context more, so the MDMA, the ecstasy, the entactogens that are going to be used as people party and celebrate. And with the background information that we're getting from our project that there's a lot of substitution, whether it be PMMA or cathinones, then I guess that's my concern, that we have, some young people who are presenting with those adverse physiological effects that don't tend to occur as much with MDMA unless people take a lot of it, but are more likely with things like PMMA or MDMA mixed with other sort of serotonergic drugs. So that's my concern. In terms of heroin in Victoria, and I'm only speaking from a very small data set here, and there's others doing other work, but in late 2020, we did see a lot of substitution of the apparent substitution of the heroin supply with benzodiazepines, particularly atizolam. And the cases we've had more recently seem to indicate just 6-man or heroin. So I don't think we're going to necessarily see a big change in that picture, but certainly the party drugs and the MDMA, we've got some concerns.
I'd have to agree with Sean. From our experience, and obviously I'm talking more from an injecting, person who injects drugs. The IDRS sample, there hasn't been any reports of people, going without because of lockdown, shall we say. The issue that we've been having has been when you need to isolate, and it's actually been really pleasing to see people who use drugs taking isolation so seriously. And we've had a fantastic response to helping people who are in isolation to access drug treatment. I think that's a big story that's going to come out of COVID is, so we're now supporting people in isolation and then getting them stabilized on drug treatment, and then kind of continuing on with engagement after lockdown, after isolation, which has been fantastic. I also I hope. Last year I was predicting that there would be, comets crashing into this, Australia and all sorts of horrible things. It didn't really happen, and I suspect that in terms of methamphetamine and heroin, I hope it won't. But yes, absolutely, the party drug thing is a real worry. It's not my expertise, but what Sean's saying rings very true. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Gang, we've got a couple of questions that are substance specific, and I think some of these are for Rachel, but they're also broader. The first one is like, are there any signals about pregabalin or tramadol? Rachel or maybe Sean.
Yeah, so I didn't present that data and a lot of the pharmaceutical opioid data because we haven't seen changes this year. So we do ask about pregabalin and tramadol. And I think it was about 15% or so who reported using pregabalin, non-prescribed pregabalin in the past 6 months, and probably about 8% who reported tramadol, but no kind of substantial changes. I believe that Shane Dark at NDARC is currently doing a paper looking at tramadol in deaths. So that'll be an interesting to keep an eye on. But yeah, no real kind of detections that from the IDRS.
Thank you. And Rachel, I think the next one is sorry, forgive me. Did I just talk over the top of you, Sean? I'm so sorry.
That's absolutely fine. It's this new world we live in, isn't it? Trying to coordinate technological conversations across many miles. I was just literally going to say, along with Rachel, the pregabalin and tramadol signal in our data set of the 500 odd cases has been very small. A handful of cases, but certainly we're not seeing pregabalin within presentations to the same degree we're seeing diazepam, atazolam, and all the benzos. So it's not appearing to be there as a benzo substitute, if you like, which might have been expected considering its pharmaceutical properties, and tramadol very rarely.
Thank you. The next question is about, which I think is particularly for Rachel, is like, are the methamphetamine increases New South Wales or Australia specific, or has this increase been reported in other countries? Actually, that's could be a broad question as well.
Yeah, I mean, good question and difficult to say. I mean, if you look at the UNODC World Drug Report, it kind of varies across countries. So I think their most recent report kind of reported increases in kind of East and Southeast Asia. And in countries like Africa or whatnot, you'll have quite low levels of methamphetamine use. But again, that data is also a little bit lagged. So it's not, some of those trends might not become apparent, until the next kind of report, which we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you. Was there anyone else who wanted to comment? This next question, it's directed to Chris, but I wonder if Susie would be interested in this one as well. It's Chris, in the opioid replacement therapy space, have you found an increased awareness or use of injectable buprenorphine as an alternative, particularly during lockdown periods?
Yes, is the answer. And we've actually found, so it's actually been really interesting and quite highly dependent on the prescriber involved, and the policy framework, the clinical framework that they operate under. We've seen some people who have already on injectable buprenorphine strongly prefer to continue that treatment over isolation, and I think that shows just how wonderful the treatment is for people, who are stable and want to put their drug use behind them. An injection once a month, fabulous. You don't even have to think about it. Off you go to get on with your life. And we've seen people strongly advocate to continue that. Because at first in the ACT, there was a little bit of unsureness about using injectable buprenorphine for people in isolation in particular, but that's been overcome. We have, although, so the majority of inductions that we've done in isolation have been around either injectable buprenorphine or Suboxone. Methadone is difficult, you know, just simply because it's more dangerous. In terms of lockdown overall, we have a fairly good uptake of injectable buprenorphine in the ACT, kind of like, I think this is just kind of data from the public clinic in the ACT. About a third of new inductees choose to go onto injectable buprenorphine from Suboxone pretty quickly. And then, so yes, we have seen it used, but then obviously there's a treatment matching and choice thing going on here, right? So we've had people who have said, absolutely not. I need methadone. That's what I need. You know, buprenorphine as a molecule doesn't work for me. As a drug doesn't work for me. And in fact, and we've worked hard to make sure that they've been able to access those choices. So yes, long-acting injectable buprenorphine has been very useful in this situation. But again, only one of a suite of replacement therapies that are available to us, and we've got to be careful to make sure that we treatment match and allow client choice.
Couldn't agree more, Chris. And we've really seen, particularly in New South Wales, really fantastic uptake of depot buprenorphine, and I think that's exactly as you say, for those for whom it works well, it's been excellent, and certainly within lockdown. But I've been really impressed with the response of the AOD sector, particularly in opioid treatment. Particularly, the need for increasing takeaways to people. And what we did see is that the sky, as you say, didn't fall in. And in fact, what it's meant for a lot of the local health districts, and that they've, shared with me and with others, has been that, they've able to really look into how practice is delivered, or services are delivered to people who are on OTP, that there is the possibility of a greater flexibility about that, that people who are on opioid treatment, for whom it works well, and that, as you say, they're in a good position to manage that among all the other things that are going on, whether that's sort of family or work or what have you. It's been really, really helpful, and I suppose tells us how important it is to wrap that treatment around the person and what's right for them. And so I think, the silver lining to COVID anyway, as far as I can see with the AOD treatment, is the opportunity to be more flexible, to listen to what people would like, what works for them best, and to be able to respond accordingly. And perhaps, this situation has provided those options for us. So, I really echo what you've been saying, Chris, and I just, I suppose overall, what we'd like to see in the treatment sector is that we learn from some of these changes and continue them accordingly.
Thanks, Susie. Sean, we've got a couple of questions that are directed to you. So one is Sean's team finding an increase in emergency presentations due to negative drug interactions due to the patient taking a drug that is different to what they're expecting to take?
Very good question, but a difficult one to answer, because we often don't know the intent of the drug exposure or use. In terms of interactions, there's not a lot that is showing up where we look at our analytical findings and think, goodness, that's probably why they've become unwell. Having said that, there are some cases where there's MDMA in a cathinone or MDMA in another sympathomimetic drug, which has probably increased toxicity. So the signal's small. I guess one of the things when we compare the data from our data set and obviously what Rachel presented is that they're very different populations. People that end up in an emergency department, we don't have a good idea of the underlying prevalence. So how many people are using the same drugs or the same mixture of drugs who don't end up in the emergency department? So without that denominator, it's very difficult to make some of these judgments. We're also limited a little bit by the resources we do have available in terms of sampling. So this is very much a convenient sample when site investigators are able to include cases. So the data set is best used as an early warning system data rather than data where we can make firm conclusions about particular outcomes because we don't have that underlying population information.
All right, thank you. And the other question, Sean, was just more, are you publishing your findings? Are you publishing this work? It would be useful to add to the literature.
Absolutely, and as soon as COVID settles down and enables me to have some time to sit down with my keyboard, absolutely.
So everyone keep open for drshawngreen.com.au. Okay.
There's plenty of other people in the team that we're working on some at the moment, but one of the successes of the project is that it's we're getting more sites on board and we're spending a lot of our time actually expanding the project rather than publishing our findings. We need to get on and do that.
Thank you. The next, it's not really a question, I think it's just a comment, so we'll take it as a comment. And it was, look, we saw an escalation in methamphetamine use, more severe use in 2006 to 2010, and the associated impact on treatment services, e.g. the need for more detox. Still, we've not really changed services much to deal with this. There's still no perceived need for inpatient detox and more intensive treatments for people with severe levels of use. I think we'll take that as a comment unless there's anything anyone would like to say. Susie, I see you lunging forward.
Look, only to say it does often, whilst there has been lots of good improvements in terms of the way we deliver the service system, sometimes the way in which services are funded and the way in which we have traditionally delivered things does hamper some of that innovation. And so I suppose what is useful is that we continue to listen to the people who reach out for treatment about what works best for them, that we do the research to document its efficacy, and then we respond accordingly. So I take the point. I think it's a good comment to make, and there's more that needs to be done in that space, and that takes resources, and so we'll continue to advocate in that regard.
Thanks, Susie. Any other comments, gang?
Yes, I totally agree. It's been really tricky to kind of wrap drug treatment options around someone who's using methamphetamine, especially daily use, like a large quantity. They really need serious inpatient support, and if they can't get that, then things tend to spiral pretty quickly, and it's and absolutely, Susie, it takes funding. It's not that, but I can tell you one of the things that I've pulled my hair out about in the last 6 months is, why aren't we more on top of our methamphetamine treatment options? Why can we make somebody who's dependent on opioids comfortable quite quickly in order to make them safe for everybody, especially under a public health kind of crisis like this? And yet it's a nightmare when it comes to methamphetamine users. So I think completely valid.
Yeah, I agree, Chris. I think what we know is our traditional ways, particularly in terms of withdrawal management, are hinged around alcohol and opioids. And so I think we still have a lot to learn about whether hospital settings are helpful for people, and what are some of the other options in terms of stepping down, appreciating that particularly for long-term, as you say, daily methamphetamine use, we're looking for much longer trajectory in terms of that withdrawal experience. And so therefore, you know, how we can manage that better perhaps in the community when keeping, exactly as you say, keeping people comfortable, or in settings that are less intense, because we know that for a lot of people, you know, they do need that intensive support. And however, you know, hospital settings are often, you know, not necessarily as useful as perhaps other options. And so I think what we are also seeing though is that there is a greater appreciation for that longer trajectory, and therefore some other services being able to tailor their programs so that people can come in. If their withdrawal management needs are quite low intensity, then they can be done in a residential setting, but not necessarily in hospital. And so I suppose it just tells us that you're quite right. We just need to do more, and we need to really think about the flexibility of the treatment service sector. And hopefully, you know, we're seeing a little bit more of that with things like day programs and with more sort of low intensity withdrawal management.
It also feels like there's a bit of a training gap potentially, you know, around how, you know, how do you engage with someone who's on methamphetamine? You know, what options in terms of, you know, kind of the CBT stuff and mindfulness, and you know, how do you, but really, how do you engage with someone? How do you de-escalate somebody who's going through that kind of really kind of chaotic, I've taken too much methamphetamine thing that happens, and it's almost like there's this kind of a fear, and this comes from, you know, years and years of media, you know, about, oh, this person's going to be aggressive and it's going to be violent, and I need to ring the police if I'm going to engage with them, if I'm an ambulance, and if an ambo, and you know, so I think there's a training gap there around, you know, de-escalating, letting people breathe, you know, okay, let's talk through what we're going to do, how we're going to wrap support around you.
Totally. I mean, I think, you know, we were very quick to respond, and I know for probably yourself, you know, Sean, I'm not saying that there haven't been some challenging moments in emergency departments in particular, but we know that for a lot of people, particularly if they are experiencing methamphetamine related psychosis, you know, a busy emergency department is not the best space for those people. And, you know, it tells us that we do need to be a bit more creative, and certainly in terms of the education, we know that because of that hysteria that was quite widely promoted around methamphetamine, it really undermined the confidence of people working even in the AOD sector, who were very accomplished, you know, well-skilled clinicians, but suddenly felt like perhaps there was a whole new thing they needed to learn, and because of that fear and that low grade sort of worry about what will I do, and yet what we know is that it comes back to those very useful therapeutic skills, which is really about engaging with the person, building that therapeutic rapport, hearing what's going on for them, and as you say, some of that real appreciation for what the person is going through in that moment, and so bringing down the intensity of what's happening around them. And so, yeah, I agree. I think there's still a necessity to educate the community more broadly, and also the health system itself, because it's all very well for the alcohol and other drug sector to be well educated around how to respond and support someone. But I think, you know, there's a broader health sector education that needs to happen about the people who use drugs are just people. And if they're reaching out for your support, perhaps a little bit of empathy would go a long way.
That's great. Thank you very much, Susie. Gang, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. That happened very, very quickly. There's a comment there that just thanks everyone for the panel discussion. There's a comment there talking about how injectable buprenorphine has definitely been useful for their services. There was one question that if we had more time, I would have loved to have just wrapped up with it, which was about, this person asks about their specific service, but I think it's good generally. It's like, what have we been doing well, but what do we need to improve on? And it would have been good to hear from each of us. I mean, I might be cheeky. Like, why don't we, if I go 2 minutes over time, I don't know if I'll get in trouble from Jacob, but is there any last, I suppose, comments in line with that final question from either of you about, what has been working well, or what, keeping in mind all of this information we've just received from Rachel, that we could do better? One quick comment.
I'll start. First of all, I need to whip in a quick thank you to Paul Dessau. He's amazing. When I was doing this, I was like, ring Paul, help, why aren't you on this panel? Right, what do you want me to say? So thank you, Paul, you're amazing. What have we learned? We've learned so much, but again, I think it goes back to what Susie says about flexibility. We now have a service where we can deliver to pharmacotherapy to someone's door. We've got a form, lo and behold, a form that a person can sign and get consent for another person to pick up their dose from the chemist. Like this isn't really, it's not really that complicated, but it never happened before in this particular area, and so keeping some of that flexibility is going to be really, 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 really important and useful and valuable in terms of fighting stigma and discrimination and making sure health equity happens for people who use drugs.
Thank you, Chris. Susie.
Look, just to say that all of these parts are so important, that all the pieces of the puzzle that are brought together. So Rachel's data, which is giving us some signals, Sean's, which is on the front line, hearing what's coming through the door, and most importantly, Chris's from that peer and lived experience point of view. All of these parts that need to be invested in, and the opportunities to bring it all together, because that's what then serves the community best, I suppose, and starts to break down that stigma. We look at it from a health perspective, and then we can serve the people that we're here to serve.
Thank you, Susie. Sean?
In my world, the biggest challenge, I think, is the overcoming the prejudices of frontline health workers, enabling them, as Susie said, to recognise these people as human, having some empathy, and accepting them and getting them through the front door and on to other services. I see that as the biggest challenge in the frontline non-AOD working medical community.
Thank you. And Rachel, any final comments or insights from you?
No, I mean, I will, just reiterate what everybody else said. And I think, more broadly speaking, it points to that overarching point about, drug use should be treated as a health and a social issue rather than a criminal justice issue.
Thank you. Well, colleagues online, please join me in thanking Rachel, Susie, Sean, and Chris for their insights and their wisdom. Thank you all very much. And I also want to just acknowledge Leah and Kate, who have been working very, very hard doing Auslan interpreting for us all. So Sean, Rachel, Susie, and Chris, I think you can turn your screens off now. And I'll now just introduce the poster presentations, and then I'll leave you guys as well. So we're now going to be viewing 4 outstanding posters from NDARC staff and students. And first we have Udesha, or Kali as she prefers, followed by Agatha, Daisy, and then Olivia. And these will go on for 10 minutes all up, followed by some final comments from NDARC's director, Professor Mike Farrell. Thank you, colleagues.
Hi, my name's Judisha, and I'll be presenting the findings about analysis on 2011 and 2021 IDRS data on older people who inject drugs. The reason why we undertook this analysis is because we know that people who inject drugs are an aging population. We also know that aging and drug use is likely to create specific health needs and barriers to accessing services. And advances in medicines and harm reduction has meant that the population characteristics of older injecting drug users have likely changed over time. However, we know very little about this demographic, so the aim of this study was to examine the percentage of the IDRS sample who were 50 years or older from 2000 to 2021, and examine how the demographic characteristics and health profile of older participants compared to younger participants and how they have changed between 2011 and 2021. We used data collected from the IDRS, which is a national survey of people who regularly inject drugs that has been running since the year 2000. We used regression analyses to determine statistical significance with the demographic characteristics, drug use behavior, access to harm reduction and treatment programs, and mental and physical health. So as you can see, we found that the percentage of the participants who were 50 years or older has gradually increased to almost 1/3 of the IDRS sample in 2021. We also found that while our regression analysis did not find older age to be significantly associated with any of the characteristics we looked at using the 2011 data set, we found in 2021, compared to younger injecting drug users, older injecting drug users were more likely to identify as male, live in their own home, and nominate heroin to be the drug injected the most often in the last month. Our adjusted regression analysis confirmed that older injecting drug users were significantly less likely to report any needle sharing in 2011 and 2021. We also found that older participants were significantly less likely to score a high or very high distress score in 2011 and 2021, even after adjusting for other factors. So what does this tell us about older injecting drug users? We found the strengths of older injecting drug users to include the reduced likelihood to share needles and report poor mental health. These strengths may support older injecting drug users in managing their own health and well-being despite the challenges created by aging and drug use. Future research would benefit from focusing on the strengths of older injecting drug users to assist specialized services in delivering strength-based programs to their older clients. Thank you.
My name is Agata Chrzanowska and I'm going to present results of our study on unintentional and intentional drug poisoning deaths in Australia. Fatal drug poisoning is a key contributor to mortality and it's been increasing in several countries. Given differences between unintentional and intentional drug poisoning deaths and different prevention strategies, it's important to understand the drug involvement patterns and demographic characteristics of individuals displaying these profiles. We identified drug poisoning deaths from cause of death unit record files, and the drugs involved were categorized into 8 classes. Intentional deaths were more likely to involve hypnosedatives, other psychotropic medicines, and non-opioid analgesics and anesthetics, while unintentional deaths were more likely to involve heroin, other opioids, alcohol, stimulants, and cannabinoids. Compared with unintentional deaths, intentional deaths were more likely among females than males, and those aged 15 to 24 and 55 plus than the reference group 34 to 44 years. 60% of both unintentional and intentional drug poisoning deaths involved more than one drug class. Having a large number of combinations of the drug classes, the upset plot was a great tool to identify the most common intersections and explore differences in age and sex distribution between the drug pattern profiles within and between the intents. Opioids excluding heroin and heroin were the most common profiles in unintentional deaths. Deaths involving heroin or stimulants only had a greater proportion of males and younger individuals than other unintentional profiles. Hypnosedatives and other psychotropic medicines were the most common intentional profiles. Intentional deaths involving opioids excluding heroin and hypnosedatives were mostly concentrated among those aged over 55. Drug pattern profiles, which involved other psychotropic medicines, had a higher proportion of females than other profiles. Given differences in profiles between intentional and unintentional deaths, overdose prevention efforts should be tailored to address these differences. For more details, have a look at my poster, and complete results will be soon published in the Drug and Alcohol Dependence.
Hi, my name is Daisy, and I am recording this on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge their continued connection and care for the land and waters. I'm going to present some research on the profile and correlates of colorimetric reagent test kit use amongst people who use ecstasy and other illegal stimulants in Australia, and we'll look at data from 2019, 2020, and 2021. I'd like to also acknowledge the co-authors on this study and to also thank the participants in the ecstasy and related drug reporting system over the last 3 years, whose experiences have contributed to this research. So while there is strong public support, there is political opposition to the provision of drug checking services across most jurisdictions in Australia. In the absence of government-sanctioned drug checking services, Australians who use illegal drugs are generally reliant on colorimetric reagent test kits to gain information about the presence or absence of a nominated substance in their drug samples. Despite this, little evidence exists about current practices of colorimetric reagent test kit use amongst people who use illegal drugs in Australia. We aim to identify patterns and correlates of reagent test kit use, as well as the behavioural outcomes of testing amongst a sample of people who regularly use MDMA and other illegal stimulants. So as part of the ecstasy and related drug reporting system interviews in 2019, 2020, and 2021, people who lived in each capital city of Australia who regularly use MDMA or ecstasy were recruited via social media and word of mouth, and they were asked about their drug use and experience of drug markets, as well as questions about testing the contents and/or purity of their illegal drugs and the features of their last test. We use logistic regression to identify correlates of using a reagent test kit last time. So about a third of the sample reported testing the contents of their drugs in the last year, and 82% of this group had used a colorimetric reagent test kit. In terms of who was most likely to report using a reagent test kit last time they tested their drugs, these participants were more likely to be male, under 25 years old, to have used LSD or novel psychoactive drugs in the last 6 months, and to report past month drug dealing. Nearly half of those who used a colorimetric reagent test kit bought the drug as MDMA, and 4/5 detected MDMA when they tested it. Of those who tested and detected MDMA, most reported their findings to either their friends or their dealer, and 9 out of 10 participants used the tested drug. So our findings suggest that people who use MDMA and other illegal stimulants seek out information about the contents of their illicit drugs and are already engaging in drug checking practices. The predominant technologies are suboptimal though and lack tailored specialist advice and education. With more formal services that provide greater detail about the contents and purity of their tested drugs, alongside specialist advice, we could really achieve a potentially considerable reduction in drug-related harm for this group. Thank you.
Hi, my poster is about barriers and facilitators to COVID-19 vaccination among Australians who inject drugs. We undertook this research for 2 main reasons. Firstly, people who inject drugs may be more susceptible to adverse health outcomes after COVID-19 infection as a result of the higher prevalence of comorbidities in this population. And secondly, they may also be less likely to access the vaccine. And this is something we've observed for other vaccines for other diseases among the population, like hepatitis B and influenza. To do this research, we used annual surveys with people from each capital city of Australia who were at least 18 years of age and had injected illicit or non-prescribed drugs at least monthly in the past 6 months. And these interviews took place in June and July of this year, so just as the 3rd wave in Australia was beginning, but before there was the big push for vaccination. So among our sample, we saw that about half were hesitant to receive the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is higher than surveys of the general population, which are estimated to be at 20 to 30%. Vaccine hesitant participants were more likely to be female, younger, live in unstable housing, and have injected drugs daily or more frequently as compared to less than daily frequency. Key barriers to vaccination among our population related to vaccine safety and side effect concerns, low risk perception of disease transmission and disease severity, and also vaccine misconceptions like the vaccine will give me COVID. A third of our vaccine hesitant participants reported that none of our potential facilitators would increase their likelihood of getting vaccination. And among the other 2/3, there was substantial heterogeneity in what would or would not increase their likelihood to get the vaccine. But the most highly endorsed facilitator was financial incentive for vaccination. So what are the implications of these data? Firstly, there is a high level of hesitancy, and that does justify an intervention to maximize uptake. Secondly, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to optimizing vaccination uptake among people who inject drugs. This is obvious through the heterogeneity of the potential facilitators. But we do need to improve understanding of vaccine safety and utility among this population. And finally, financial incentives could lead to increased uptake among this population. Thanks for watching.
Thanks very much for all of those fascinating poster presentations. I think we're close to the close of this. We've had a very lively panel discussion. Thanks, Daniel, for chairing that, and thanks everybody for participating. I think what we've heard is how all of these different pieces need to fit together to make up the jigsaw puzzle. And I won't hold you long now, but just to say that you will be sent links and information on the email, and a recording of these sessions will be emailed to you. I think you'll also probably receive a request for some feedback on the sessions. And my final task is to announce the judges and the People's Choice for Poster Prize. And the judge's choice, I can happily say, is Samantha College for her poster named The Impacts of Opiate Agonist Treatment on Hospitalization for Injecting Related Disease, a retrospective data linkage study. And the People's Choice is Daisy Gibbs for the poster The Experience of Being Released from Prison, a Case Study. Both will receive £250 towards learning and development, and $250 and a $100 gift voucher. So congratulations to both Sam and Daisy, but congratulations to all presenters over the last 3 days. We've had a vast array of presentations of some amazing international work and national work, and I want to thank everybody and look forward to meeting you all in person in the near future. And could I finally say thanks very much to Sarah Ferguson for her very generous introduction and ongoing support. Thank you all very much.